Hello, everyone. So we are live again for yet another author live chat interview, and today, Monday, 8 p.m. CST. It's about 8:40 p.m. CST right now. We have a guest who is going to be talking about his non-fiction book. So it's supposed to be on Sunday, but because of certain issues that we cannot avoid. We are doing this on Monday, 8 p.m. CST. So there's a 1 day delay over here. So, but nevertheless, it's still a Sunday series topic. It's going to be an interesting session to talk about yet another nonfiction book with a clinical social worker. So today we have author Bruce Whealton joining us to talk about his book on real life inspiring stories. And so here's a little bit about the author. So we're going to talk about his book on overcoming shyness and loving Lynn. So a little bit about author Bruce Whealton over here. He has dedicated his life to helping others and has done so as a psychotherapist and clinical social worker. He's also a certified peer support specialist where he could use his lived experience as a survivor of trauma, injustice, and abuse to help others. He healed himself so that he could help others to heal and find hope. And in writing, he finds it to be therapeutic and a powerful part of his healing journey. And he has written in both nonfiction and poetry format. Right now, he's resuming his career journey by pursuing employment opportunities in the mental health and also psychiatric field with the ultimate goal of working as a licensed clinical social worker or psychotherapist, drawing upon many years of his experience, education, and postgraduate training in psychology and psychotherapy. So, as a peer support specialist, PSS, he uses different skills and he fills different role than that of a therapist. So a PSS is not a therapist, and it's going to be an interesting interview today to talk about that as well. So with all that he has accomplished. He believes that anything is possible. So, without further ado, let's welcome author Bruce to the show.
Hi.
Hello, Bruce. Hello, Bruce.
Hi.
Welcome to
Hi.
the show. I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time to join the show today. And
Yeah.
I believe today is going to be an interesting day to talk about interesting interview session to talk about your experiences, your vast experiences as a trauma survivor, and also right
Right.
now as a clinical social worker. And in your bio, when I was going through your bio, I just read that
Mhm.
a therapist is not a PSS. So I think it's interesting that we have different terms, different terminologies, and people may often confuse one with the other. So I think before we talk about your career, I think it would be great to have you say a few words about yourself. I know I've briefly explained about yourself, but I think so it will also be interesting to have you say a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so first of all, I am not currently a licensed clinical social worker. That's part of the story that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
I was a therapist in the 90s, and it was a long journey to get there. And the book that we were going to talk about, Overcoming Shyness and Loving Lynn, um, was the love story part of my overall story. So I had a very complex story to tell, and I was going to this writing group that was also a support group. And someone said, well, in order for people to care about what happened to you, they should get to know you. And so I
Mm.
ended up writing this very, very long story where I tried to tell everything all in one book, and it was just so large, and I'm very verbose. That's something about me. I've never had a problem coming up with words and filling up a lot of volumes of writing. Um, but I wanted to produce something that was more like a memoir that would pull content out of the bigger story and focus on creating these other smaller memoirs that were more focused. And that's the title of this current book, Overcoming Shyness and Loving Lynn. It has some material that came from the memoirs of a healer slash clinical social worker autobiography of Bruce Whealton, but it expands on that and puts a lot of focus on that love story. And what is phenomenal about that is that it took a lot of work for me to get the courage to find the skills where I would be able to meet someone and find love. And I was always like going in high school, my high school years, I was incredibly shy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and social anxiety, social phobia. I had almost no social skills when I
Mm-hmm.
went off to college, and I actually started studying engineering, and I went from aerospace to mechanical engineering to electrical engineering, and I was seeing my therapist or a psychologist on campus to help me deal with shyness because I wanted to have a life and have kids, and that meant having a wife, and I had no idea how I was going to do that. And when I first arrived in Georgia at Georgia Tech, I came from a rural community of 30,000 people into
Mm-hmm.
Metro Atlanta, where there was like 3 million or was it 5 million people in Metro Atlanta, and I knew no one there, and I didn't know how to start conversations or anything. And I ended up turning that into a strength. I
Mm-hmm.
was probably like an introvert back then, and but I became more by my senior year. I was like an extrovert,
Mm-hmm.
and um, but I still couldn't like find the courage like to speak in class. And back then in that time, I was always taught by my parents and watching back then Happy Days and things like that. Like the guy has to ask the girl out, girl's not going to be calling up a guy, and so you feel like all the pressure's on you. And if you're really shy, then it's like, and you want to be a parent someday and get married and fall in love. And I didn't know what love would be like before it actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I knew I needed to learn social skills. And then along the way, I said, I said to my psychologist, my counselor, I don't think I'm in the right field. And we found out that indeed I was, he gave me this test called the Strong Campbell Interest Inventory, and it identifies theme areas like that would be a good match for you that you might consider. And based on that, if I had taken that, I would have never considered engineering. It was just so far from being a good match for me at all. Um,
Mm-hmm.
where I did score highest is careers that were social, and then second to that was creative careers. And so I was trying to figure out what to do with that, and I made the decision, my junior and senior year, that I was going to go into social work. And I learned that you can get a master's in social work and become a clinical social worker and become a therapist with an undergraduate degree in anything. And so I thought, well, I will move in with my parents for a little while. They have a big home in North Augusta. There's a psychiatric hospital nearby. I will go there and uh, I will volunteer with the social work team, and that
Mm-hmm.
might help me get into grad school. Well, the time there was very toxic. It was a very unhealthy environment with my parents. They suddenly I decided they wanted insist or like pressure me to find work constantly, and were not supportive of my long term goals at all. And it was really painful for me, and it was very disturbing, a very abusive environment. And I would go. So I had friends in college that were
Mm-hmm.
really, really friends and were very comforting. But most of them were already paired up. Like two of my best friends were Thomas and Jolie, who were married. And so, I never had an exclusive relationship with anyone. And so I went to, I moved to my parents and I went to Georgia Regional Hospital nearby and said, my goal is to work in the social work field, and as a psychiatric social worker, I want to help others that have mental illness. And they let me work on the team. And there I met someone, but not in the capacity of being like a professional there. I I told one of the medical students that I had a cousin that had anorexia, and he said, "Oh, you should talk to Kelta. She has anorexia." And I thought, in he was saying, "Well, you could be friends with her and maybe get some insights." Um, but what ended up happening is that I started developing a very powerful, loving relationship with Kelta. It was, for the most part, rather platonic. There was um, the most we did basically was holding each other, nurturing, hugging, n- not the kind of things that boyfriends and girlfriends do, but I was in love, and I realized that, and we were always holding hands, and I would tell her I loved her every single day. But when I talked to her, and that's described in the book too, which is important because uh, she would end up dying at the end of 1990. So I graduated in '89. I
Mm-hmm.
started volunteering at this hospital in 1990 in January, and met Kelta right away. And I was seeing her constantly while she was in the hospital, and then when she got out, and I was like, I just totally loved her so much, and she made me feel so good. And sometimes I would just ask her to just hold me. I was having a very difficult time uh, dealing with living with my parents. Um, and I needed someone, and she didn't have someone else. And so, even though I think she knew I was falling in love with her, at one point she said well, she said she loved me every day, but she said she didn't think she was in love with me. I don't know why she said that. The relationship was heading in a direction that was going more away from a platonic relationship into something obviously romantic, and then she died in a fire. And that was at the end. I found out the news on January 1st of 1991, and I put down the phone and started just crying bitterly, really bitterly crying. And I started drinking the next year. I'd never had any problem, but that was of like constantly escaping from that. And I started thinking, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to help others, because I was hearing that from my mother, like you have to be perfect to help others, which what I'm doing now as a peer support specialist is actually proven that that's not true. Is like people who have been lived experience with mental illness are able to use that experience to help others. But I was doubting myself because of all the problems I had after Kelta died. And I met someone who was a English professor, and he was a published poet, and he really started nurturing my skills in writing. And so I would go there for poetry readings, and he gave me some invaluable advice on how to write poetry and how to write, free verse poetry, because that was the focus. I never did learn how to recognize meter and verse and rhyme and things like that. That free verse doesn't require that. And so when I moved to Wilmington, and that's where I would meet Lynn, uh, I had that experience with Kelsa that made me feel very special finally. Even though it was painful, I was coming there initially to share poems about that love and the loss, the grief, and all, and the pain of that. And the last thing I really expected was um, to fall in love or to find someone else that I would be interested in. And but I had the idea that I was moving again to an area where I didn't know anyone, and
Mm-hmm.
I thought I'm going to look into whether there are poetry readings in the area. And I picked up a newspaper and found out that they were indeed meeting at the Coastline Convention Center, and it was really a very nice uh, place overlooking the Cape Fear River. The sun would set over the Cape Fear River, and the the very first night I showed up, I read some poems that I had written, and they were probably a lot about the loss and the grief I was feeling over losing Kelta. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I found the courage to do that, and I knew that if I was going to be a therapist, and the role of a therapist would at times mean doing group therapy, leading groups. And I had never been the center of attention ever before. I mean, I was just always someone who, the farthest I had come in improving and overcoming my shyness was one on one. I was working at a psychiatric hospital where I met Kelta, but I would interview patients one on one basically, and I might sit in at a small staff meeting with a few interns and all, but it wasn't like getting in front of a large group of people and reading poetry. That was what I actually did the very first week I moved into Wilmington, and so it was April of 1992, and I noticed this very attractive woman named Lynn, and I don't think I noticed her at first because I was just focused on overcoming that shyness enough to be able to get in front of a crowd and read poetry.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, I noticed that she had a cough, and it would turn out that the reason for that was because she was born with a genetic illness called cystic fibrosis, and it affects the lungs and digestive system. And what it does is it causes excess mucus to build up in the body, and that causes it becomes a breeding ground for infections,
Mm-hmm.
and it scars the lungs, and so uh, it decreased her breathing capacity, and it was a terminal illness. At some level, I knew that she was that at one point not too long ago, people with this didn't even live into their adulthood years. But I kept
Mm-hmm.
hoping that they would find a cure for it. Um, and I, but so we started on July 4th. of 1992, we went out for our first date. The week before that at the poetry reading, I finally found the courage to ask her out on a
Mhm.
date, and we spent the day together, and then we went to a poetry reading, and well, there's a lot to tell. I guess that's kind of like I don't know
Mhm.
how if I should tell the whole story right now, but
Mhm.
um,
Now that's interesting. I mean, like, um, and how does your experience losing a loved one and the trauma of abuse, as when you were younger at home, with your parents. I think all these have given you a lot of experience with trauma, and how, and right now, with your the career path that you chose, um, how is it right now? Like, how are you helping others? And tell us about how different a PSS is, as
okay,
opposed to
that's a good question.
therapist.
So um, a peer support specialist is someone who draws upon lived experience. The story, without giving away the whole book, the when Lynn got sick, that was very traumatic for me. We started seeing each other in '92, got engaged in '94. Her mother bought a house and rented it to both of us, and we lived as husband and wife for the next several years. And I thought all that was going to continue,
Mhm.
but and she was very healthy for someone with this disease. So we had
Mhm.
a normal relationship, and I became more and more successful. And in fact, I would not have been successful without her support.
Mhm.
So um, I definitely have a lot of understanding for what child abuse does to people, uh,
Mhm.
and I have definitely treated people that have been exposed to trauma. One of the interesting things about uh, working as a peer support specialist now is that when you go through the training, you're told, but you're not their therapist. So
Mhm.
I I met someone who, um, but you also are told to tell your story about your own recovery from mental illness. So
Mhm.
my mental illness was not something I was born with. That was, some people have diseases like schizophrenia, which is there's a
Mhm.
genetic predisposition, and once you get it, it'll affect you for the rest of your life. And um, so I didn't have one of those diseases that was inevitable that was going to happen. My mental illness was due to events in my life. Um, so as a peer support specialist, I thought that would be a stepping stone towards getting my license back. Um, the At the same time, so the book is very complex
Mhm.
in story. It, there's a lot of discussion about normal everyday events and experiences, and just routine life and family and uh, life with Lynn and what we did for fun, and about Lynn being into pottery as well as poetry, um, and her dreams of getting a master's in fine arts. And so in the book, the reader doesn't just learn about me, they also get to know Lynn. And so I wanted to memorialize her. And a lot of times when people write a song or write a book that's dedicated to someone, most of the time you only learn about the person who's the writer themselves. You don't learn too much about the other person that they loved. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted Lynn to come alive and be real, and for people to know her as well, and not just as someone who was supportive and allowed me to be successful in my field. But my career path is a little bit different, in that many people, they become a peer support specialist because they've had mental illness and they're finding some recovery and they want to use that to help others. They've got a lot of empathy and they use that to help others. And then maybe they think to themselves, I want to go further. I want to get a social work degree or a counseling degree, and I want to work in a more clinical position. And for me, I did it differently. I got my degree, my master's in social work. I started working as a therapist, outpatient, or first in an inpatient setting, and then in an outpatient setting. And then I opened a private practice, and that all kind of collapsed in 2000. So that was my story. Like when I was studying for the peer support specialist training, or going through that training, which is a full week, everyone is invited at some time during the week to tell their recovery story. And mine was around what happened to me in 2000 when everything kind of collided all at once. I had been, someone who started off in undergraduate school as shy, having no social skills, to becoming someone very successful in the field, opening my own private practice, having people pay me even out of pocket for help with their relationships. And I was treating people with more complex conditions that include trauma, but also include other conditions, a range of different disorders. And I also gained recognition among my colleagues. I was the president of the local society of clinical social workers, and I arranged meetings of social work or clinical social workers. I set up ongoing training. So I had name recognition among my colleagues. I had overcome the challenges of being shy and not having social skills, to being someone who had a lot of really powerful skills. And I also, what was successful about me is that I was giving well-meaning advice by someone I went to for some counseling, and I just wanted to actually experience being hypnotized. I was studying clinical hypnosis, and I wanted to actually experience that. And so in a relationship with a psychologist there, I said, well, I'm thinking about going into private practice. And he said, I would discourage that. It's a saturated market, meaning that there wasn't really a need for another social worker in Wilmington or another therapist in Wilmington. And I proved them wrong. I mean, I went to my mentor and started renting an office from him at $15 an hour for whenever I needed the office. And my private practice grew so fast that I was able to quickly need to go and rent my own office.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just like in 98 and through 2000, I was like on top of the world. Everything was going great. I was successful. And I had love. I had family, a home. Everything seemed perfect. And
Mm-hmm.
then, and then everything collided that could possibly go wrong started happening in 2000. Like, I had met someone um, who was like a cult leader. That's the best way to describe it. He was he was a psychopath who was
Uh-huh.
he was pretending to be a therapist online,
Mm-hmm.
and he referred some people to me, and then he ended up that he diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. And
Mm-hmm.
at first, I just thought he did that with, he just happened to run into one person that had that problem. But uh, I learned that he was a much more dangerous person who was making people a lot worse. And I became a target for him because, I mean, I don't even know. I can't get into his mind, but that he convinced 5 of my clients to write a grievance letter to the board, licensure board. And I found out about that the same time in which Lynn's illness uh, became overwhelming for her. She had been well, through most of her relationship, but in like late July, she started losing weight. She couldn't. She went into the hospital once.
Mm-hmm.
To They put her on IV antibiotics, and they couldn't, or they let her out, but then on antibiotics, and she got worse and worse, and had to go back in the hospital. And I really thought that she was going to die, and there was nothing I could do. So I literally saw her gasping for air. She could not
Mm-hmm.
breathe, just doing normal things around the house, like walking into another room. And eventually she'd have to get on uh, oxygen. She'd have to go
Mm-hmm.
on oxygen. And that was overwhelming me. And also, I was dealing with clients that had trauma. Now, you were asking me about the role of trauma. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I had in the early years maybe dealt with trauma, like a client here and there, and helped them process um, some traumatic events like being raped or something like that. And it would just be a single incident, or um, it wasn't. It was just like one client at a time that was dealing with that, and then I ended up getting a number of clients that were dealing with multiple traumatic events that occurred early in life, and they were getting much worse, and their flashbacks were um, very intense. And my because of other things happening in my life, I was like drawn into their dissociated state of mind. Like a person with a dissociative disorder, so a person who has been traumatized one time as an adult will deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. But if a person's been seriously traumatized very, very early in life, they might dissociate and create other personalities. and that's dissociative identity disorder. And I was advised by my colleagues you should only take one or two of those at a time. But they, I saw that when this character that was like a cult therapist, psychopath, was treating people, he moved from Pennsylvania down, I think it was Pennsylvania or Virginia, back
Mm-hmm.
into the household with the first client he referred to me, and he was like doing therapy there, and that person was getting worse and worse. And then I would find out that other clients were going over there thinking he can help them, and instead they were just getting worse because he didn't have any degree or personal training, or any college training,
Mm-hmm.
any specialized training of any sort, any preparation. Um, he had previously, uh, before moving to Wilmington, he had convinced some people online to get on an airplane, fly to where, I forget whether it was Virginia or Pennsylvania, but his home, he called it a treatment facility, and he had convinced people who had a serious mental illness to fly to his to his treatment facility. And he said he had a nurse on staff. It was basically his girlfriend. I don't know how he convinced anyone to be with him. Um, but So then, uh, I didn't find this out until like after he had moved in and started. He was setting up a shop there in that house where, um, the first client he referred to me, he moved into that household. And so he moved in with her husband, and their son, who was close to an adult. And he brought two other girls with them, or young females with him, and introduced them to me for therapy. And I was like thinking to myself, they're going to be going to him if I don't see them. That they're going to be just rely on him for help, and that he has no preparation, no training, no expertise. And it was very, very complicated. Um, so I saw him as like, I began to see him as very evil and malicious and cruel. And the word, I felt like I needed to do something, but I didn't know what I could do because everything I learned was in private therapy consultations. And the famous last words of Lynn when she thought I was going to try to do something, like tell the authorities or something like that, she said, "Don't get involved." And I'm like, "Well, what can he do to me?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would find out later that he convinced five of my clients that had dissociative disorders to file a grievance with the licensure board. And I found out about this at the same time while Lynn's in the hospital fighting for her life, and it was just so overwhelming for me. And so writing the book in that way was cathartic because all I could think about for the longest time was the way I acted during
Mm-hmm.
that like 60-day period from like late July of 2000 through
Mm-hmm.
September, and it's all very blurry and fuzzy. I became like my life was very chaotic. I was so overwhelmed by everything. I was sometimes when you treat people with these disorders and they're coming to you hour for several hours, one after the other, um, I was no longer able to stay grounded, and I was becoming traumatized by witnessing the stories with them of their trauma, um, that they were describing to me. in hour after hour of sessions where I was agreeing to see them and trying to balance that with visiting Lynn in the hospital. And it just really overwhelmed me. And for a while there, I wasn't in my right mind. I wasn't well. Um, I was acting just to this day. I don't know what actually was going on because usually you think of mental illness as something that there's like a predisposition for it and there's signs before, but there hadn't been. I didn't have any uh, problems before, and it's not like COVID, where you can get
Mm-hmm.
catch COVID like an infection, and
Mm-hmm.
then you get better.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like catching a mental illness that lasts for a couple months
Mm.
and made me act in ways that were irrational and dissociated from reality. I was like living in a dream that was like a nightmare. And this was when Lynn needed me the most. And because she was fighting for her life, and she said, I wish you had kept in touch with our friends because I cannot support you right now in and you're needing help because you're going through a lot of things. My career was being destroyed. I mean, these grievances meant that
Mm-hmm.
my license was being suspended,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to close up the entire shop. I had
Mm.
so I have memories like and it's something where you don't see it coming, and also the relationship was something where when I tell about it,
Mm-hmm.
most people would say this is the kind of relationship up until that point where you're thinking these people are going to be together for decades. This is a
Mm-hmm.
relationship that's just one of those ideal relationships. Or, I'm not saying we didn't fight. We argued all the time, but it never changed our love for each other. It was, um, there's one scene in the book, as a matter of fact, where I describe, we had this argument. I don't even know what we're arguing about, but we were like weren't speaking, and we go to a poetry reading by one of our mutual friends. He's releasing a new poetry book, and so we go there. My brother's there actually, and we take a seat upstairs. Lynn and I are still not talking, but so there's this tension. We've been arguing, and I go downstairs and I get a tea, just iced tea, just the way Lynn likes it, and I go to Jean, our mutual friend, and ask for two autographed books. And I said, "Can you autograph one? Give me two copies. Autograph one to me, and then one to Lynn." And so I did this, and I brought it upstairs, and I handed it to Lynn and her tea, and she saw that just as that it was prepared just the way she liked it. I didn't remember right now how I did it, but it was pretty obvious I was um, had it prepared just the way she liked it. And she looked up and smiled and said, like, I can't even stay mad at you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and then there's this other scene, like in April of 2000, just before like everything started going wrong, where we were just so close, and you could see in it, I describe a scene where I'm repeating over and over to her how much I love her, and she's telling me how she just can't get close enough to me. We're just holding each other intimately, and um, we're just so close to each other. And the romance. This is like or we we've been engaged, living together since '94. This is 2000,
Mm-hmm.
and the romance and all that is still alive, and everything's wonderful. And you think that these are people that are going to be together for years and years to come.
Mm-hmm.
and then she gets sick, and I don't know how to deal with that, and I've got all these things going on in my career. And she tells me, when she went in the second time, she said, I'm going to stay with my mother for a little while because you're not keeping the house clean enough. That was the first sign. And then she also said that because of the things I was dealing with, she said she had to focus on her healing. And then when she said she may not be coming back, shortly after that, her mother is reaching out to me and telling me I need to come and pick up my belongings. And it was like, I literally felt dead. It just, it hit me out of the blue. And, it is so dramatic that I don't have a name or a clear definition for what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It was like I don't know, the generic term might be a nervous breakdown, but
Mm-hmm.
acting irrational. But it was still my behaviors were things that were making things even more complicated for Lynn instead of easier. And I also couldn't deal with the idea that like she wanted to leave this relationship where just a month before that it was all perfectly fine, and
Mm-hmm.
she'd tell me how she were in bed together holding each other, and she says I can't get, she's trying to get closer and closer, like you know in Christianity they talk about how two become one body. That's
Mm-hmm.
what she was expressing, that we were like one body, and that she wanted to be that close to me. And then to think that like after that, she's going to be telling me that she's not coming back and that the relationship was over. It just, I could not make sense of all that. It was just so tragic. It wasn't the only time. There was one other time where she had to go into the hospital. Her health got a little bit worse. Um, it was about 96, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And she went in because her oxygen saturation had been low, and her they had showed on one clinic visit that there was uh, some mucus or problems. I don't remember all the details, but
Mm-hmm.
she was not doing well, and she had to go in the hospital. But when she came out, she went. We went back to our normal life, and
Mm-hmm.
I also had a life with her family too. That her family had, like her cousin um, had two little girls, and I was always like really good with kids. I loved kids. I always wanted to be a father, a parent. And when they would come, uh, they knew that they could count on me to occupy the kids, while Lynn would talk to her cousin and her cousin's husband, and I would occupy the kids' time. And that was something that was just so wonderful too, because it was such a great experience. I felt like I had a family there. Now my own family was totally and completely absent during this entire time. I mean, um, I don't know. My sister had maintained a relationship with them. My brother did. I don't know why I was the black sheep of the family. We
Mm-hmm.
all we all experienced the same abuse and trauma, but they dealt with it differently. And I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
maybe because they saw me as a liberal, and because of social worker, liberal, socialist, whatever, um, that might have been, politics might have gotten into been problematic in the family. But I don't know. There was more to it than that. It's just they just didn't. It didn't seem like they wanted to. They didn't really care about me. And actually, my mother was very narcissistic, and the family became very narcissistic as a family unit. And so, you know, my brother John and Carrie, my sister, she also didn't try to be part of my life either. Like I would
Mm-hmm.
we would go visit Lynn's family, her cousins and all, but we wouldn't go see my sister or my brother hardly ever. I mean, it was just so strange. I mean, they didn't come and stay for several days like Lynn's side of the family would do, but my family just wouldn't do that,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
So,
Um,
writing this book and the other books as well on your Amazon page, we can see over here you've also written three other books. So, what do you hope the readers would take away from all these books, and how do you hope that your books would be able to at least help one people out there? Like, what is your
well,
message for your readers out there?
um, that's a very good question. So I write with the idea of addressing a reader, like talking to at times, like in the books I go from saying dear reader, and then um so I'm aware of something I want to say or tell the reader, and then I move into a narrative of events. So I want to evoke a reaction in people. I want to draw them into the story, and I want them to understand um, that more about mental illness. I mean, I love reading stories about other people's lives. I've always loved that. And as a social worker, part of what we do is we hear the stories of people and their life stories and what brought them to where they are. And so we don't just you know, use the medical model that a psychiatrist might use to look at someone. We look at someone's life and their psychosocial story. And I love reading stories about people who have dealt with mental illness. And so it is maybe it will inspire other people to want to write stories like this. And I hope people or I will build a following, and I would like to think that I would be known and my story will be
Mm-hmm.
known. People will know me better by the
Mm-hmm.
story, and having read the story, maybe I
Mm-hmm.
my audience can help me make sense of life,
Mm-hmm.
and how and to tell, like in another book I quote from that song by um what's his name in the New York Minute by um what's his name, from the Eagles, about you know you better hold on to love, one day they're here, next day they're gone. um and so that's like a really important message, is like hold on to what's so precious to you, and um uh, be aware of what's going on in your life, and how precious and easy it is to lose things. Like even um, I don't know. I like hearing other people's stories, and I think I would wonder. I think the stories that we tell connect us with others who have very unique stories, and maybe someone will read it and say, "Oh, I can kind of relate to that." Um, because it may not be exactly the same, story as someone else's life, but maybe they'll see some parallel in their own life, and um, and want to read more of my books and see what happens next, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe they'll enjoy the story too and be
Uh-huh.
moved and react and feel something, feel a lot of emotions as they're happening, and yeah, I want to evoke a response and a reaction. I want people to feel what's happening.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Now, I think we definitely have discussed a lot about yourself, your journey, your experience about being a clinical social worker, and also dealing with trauma, and how you overcame shyness, and finally how you found love, and also how you are coping with the lost. You cope with the lost in the past, and how you're dealing with it right now, and how those lived experiences have made you who you are right now, and that's how it is helping you to help others at this point of time. I think it was fantastic, and I believe that is also the reason why you have wrote all four books of yours. All four books of yours are there to tell a message to people out there, to um, convey message of survival, and how to survive even amidst trauma, surviving trauma, even amidst lots of struggles that we go through in a daily life. So I think that was really fantastic, and I hope that people will be picking your book up, and or go to wattpad.com to read your book. And I also have actually
Right.
displayed your website over here, which will be redirected to the Wattpad page.
And
So that's
it's
Bruce
on
Wilton.
Amazon too. Yeah, it's
Yes,
on.
brucewilton.com. brucewilton.com/livinglynn. So that's where readers can read the book, and also on amazon.com. They can go to amazon.com to get a copy of your book and read it. So from the perspective of a clinical social worker, I think you have more perspective. I believe you have added more perspective into the book to help people in a more professional manner. So I hope people would be picking your book up and reading it, and hopefully we will be able to meet soon in another interview series. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bruce, and it was a pleasure talking to you. I hope that we will be able to meet soon in another interview series to come. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Could you put the link to the book on Amazon? So,
Yes,
okay, great. Yeah, make sure that's.
yes. So this is where people can get a copy of your book. Precisely, this is where they can get a copy of your book. Type Bruce Whealton, and your books will also be appearing over there. So
Right.
thank you so much. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining, Bruce. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
See you soon.
All right.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye
All
bye.
right. Bye.